Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Emeritus Steve Mason. Thank you for joining us on the History Valley Podcast, Steve Mason.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Steve Mason is the author of numerous books, including Josephus and the New Testament, Flavius Josephus on the Pharisees, Josephus, Judea and Christian Origins, and numerous other books. He was once a professor at the University of Toronto from 1989 to 2011. Then he worked as the Lang Chair of New Testament Exegesis at the Aberdeen University from 2011 to 2015. And from 2015 to 2021, he worked as professor at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands before retiring in 2021. Today, we're going to be talking about, the topic, although it does center around Josephus and the New Testament, we're also going to be focusing a bit on problems with translating Josephus. But many of the other questions will pertain to what he discusses in that book, and it's available on Amazon. The links and everything's in the description of the video to go check, so you can go check them out. I enjoyed reading the book. I loved it, and I think you guys will enjoy it as much as I did. Okay, so first question: what are the problems with translating Josephus's works? I ask because if there are such severe problems with the translations that have been done with Josephus, does that mean we really can't say that we have the exact material Josephus wrote because of textual variations? And what are the implications of this if that's the case?
I'm glad you asked, Jacob. You alerted me that you might ask this question. You would ask this question likely when you invited me. So I took the liberty of preparing a little kind of visual aid to help us understand this, because I think it's not widely understood. So can we go ahead and share that screen?
Yeah.
In this case, I really think that a picture's worth more than 1,000 words. So let me try to take us through this. Can you see the screen all right?
Yeah, I can
the beginning
see
of it. Yeah, okay. So I think the biggest problem is when people think about translating any ancient text, also the New Testament or, Tacitus or anybody else, they think, okay, we have the original, right? And then the question is, what's going on? Are the translations any good or whatever? So let me remind those who are watching, or inform maybe those who don't know about how ancient writing worked. So we begin with Josephus. He wrote, or he dictated, quite possibly to a stenographer, in Greek. And the person who wrote it down wrote on these papyrus scrolls or rolls. Now, when he wrote, we don't, as I'll point out in a second, we don't have what he wrote. We don't have his originals. But here's a fragment just to the right of Josephus here of a text we do have from the first century. So this is the kind of thing he would have written, okay? And what you see there is it's all in capital letters, right? Capital Greek letters. That's all anybody was writing in. We call it majuscules. No word divisions, no accents, no nothing. Just making the most of the papyrus, right? So just writing like that. So Josephus would have written something like that. And when he was finished, we know, because he says in a later work, that he gave 12, 15 copies. So he had copies made, which means slaves probably had to sit there and copy out the text by hand, right? The whole 30 volumes or 7 volumes of War. And we also know it went into the imperial library. So what happened after that? Well, it was frequently copied. And how that works is if somebody wants a copy of it, they send their slave to the library and he sits there or is able to borrow a copy and copy it out, right? And that happened through the first 3 centuries or so. And then after that, Christians took a great interest in Josephus' work and they copied it out. So Christian monks sitting in a room, probably with somebody reading out a master copy, would read it out and they would copy it down from what they heard, right? And then also his works were often quoted by other authors, such as Eusebius in the 4th century Christian writer. He extensively quoted from Josephus. So that's another kind of avenue of preservation. And then his Greek text was translated into Latin, into Syriac, into Hebrew later on in the Middle Ages. So what happens in this process? His original texts were completely lost, right? Because people are now relying on later copies, obviously. So nobody knows what became of his originals. So all we have are copies, quotations, and translations. And not only his originals were lost, but also centuries of copies were lost. So that, in fact, today, when we look back, the earliest copies we have of the Greek text are from the 10th century. And other copies from the up until the 15th century. Of course, what happens in the 15th century is printing press is created, and so you have printed versions after that. So how many? Well, we have I think about 31 Greek manuscripts have been found, and 146 Latin manuscripts. So the Latin translation even became much more popular than the original Greek. So that's what we have now. I gave you an illustration of the original papyrus rolls, right? But now, by the Middle Ages, everything has changed, and people are writing in what's called codex form. Many of your viewers will know this. A codex is a gigantic book with bound, sewn, binding and cut pages, like a modern book, only much larger. And these were still being written by hand. So there's still manuscripts, but now they're looking different because, of course, Greek has evolved over those centuries. And so here's what one of the latest handwritten manuscripts we have looks like. This one's from the 15th century in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. But you see now a whole bunch of new characteristics, a few of which I've underlined here. You see word divisions. You see that it's in cursive script, right? So a kind of lowercase script with accents and word divisions and margins. And you have also all kinds of interesting things have been added to it. So some of it is smudged, right? Around here you see smudges, and you can't even, in one case, you can't really tell what the text says. Then you have corrections, and some of these are between the lines. So the scribe either misheard or doesn't think it looks right, and so writes a correction in between the lines or in the margins, because now you have plentiful margin space. And so sometimes they write corrections in the margins. So this is what happens in copying, right? People make mistakes. People aren't sure. It doesn't look right, especially with place names they never heard of, all these strange personal names. Is that right? Does that sound correct? That doesn't sound like a proper name, and so on. So we also have, for contrast, this is more a presentation copy from the 12th century, and this is a Latin translation of the Antiquities 127 and following. And you can see it's beautiful, right? In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth, it says in Latin. But now you don't have all the corrections because this is a presentation copy. It's beautifully written in a perfectly even scribal hand. And it's for, obviously, with all the effort that's gone into it, it's for presentation. So now, what do scholars do when they want to translate Josephus? Obviously, you can't go around to the few libraries in the world that have in their rare books collection these codexes. It's just not practical, right? And then sit down and compare them all. So somebody had to do that work. And in the late 19th century, that's what happened. So a scholar named Benedictus Niese, a German scholar, of course, went to all the trouble of visiting some European libraries, transcribing the main manuscripts So he decided that of the 31 Greek manuscripts, 7 of them were really the best. They were earliest from the 10th and 11th centuries. And those 7 are really worth comparing. So what he did was we call collating. He made a critical Greek edition. So here, this is a photograph of what the critical Greek edition looks like. And you see, he says, he tells you right at the top of each apparatus part which manuscripts he's consulted. And you see right away, these are the opening lines of the Jewish War in Greek. And already there's a difference between page 1 and page 2. So on page 1, you have these 6 Greek manuscripts indicated by P, M, L, V, and C. And then the Latin translation, he says that's worth looking at. And for this first page, Eusebius Church History 3:9 quotes a bit of this passage. Whereas on the next page, there's no Eusebius Church History anymore. It's just those 6 manuscripts and the Latin. Whereas if you go on a little bit, a few pages later, he's got a couple more Greek manuscripts that have the whole business, like manuscript A and R. So then he shows you in this lower part what the significant differences are. And it's quite amazing, right? So already here you have all these variants. Now, most of them are really quite small, but not at the beginning here. So he's already showing you manuscript P has all this, whereas M has this, and so on. And Eusebius Church History down here at the bottom has a slightly different reading. So what have you got? Well, then he says, okay, here's the text that I propose. This is what I am conjecturing on the basis of all these differences and similarities where the manuscripts agree. This is what I'm proposing that Josephus actually wrote. So in other words, what we call the original Greek is not the original Greek. We don't have the original Greek. It is so the version that scholars use when they translate Josephus is this 19th century collation and reconstruction of what we might guess Josephus actually wrote originally, right? So thousands of decisions have been made about the word choice, the punctuation, and all of that. So I realize I'm banging on here, Jacob, but what I wanted to show you, unless you stop me, are 3 modern translations. Now we won't go through these, but I just want to make a couple quick observations about them. So these are all quite well. One's from a century ago, and this is the main kind of most famous, aside from Whiston's translation, which we might come to later. This is the main kind of scholarly translation, the Loeb Classical Library by Henry St. John Thackeray. So Josephus wrote that first sentence in 264 words. Right? So this entire first page and most of the second page, that's one sentence in Greek. And what I want to tell you is that, already you have a problem, right? When you want to render that in English, you have to make a whole bunch of choices. Well, first of all, do you want a sentence in English that's 264 words long? No, nobody wants that. So this guy in the 1920s, he already broke it into 10 sentences in English, right? Whereas the guy who did it in 2010, Irish priest, brilliant scholar, he made it just 5 sentences, and he kept the whole first block as one sentence. Whereas the most recent translation, which is brilliant as well, by a really accomplished classicist, Martin Hammond, he makes it 12 sentences because these people are saying, look, in English, the idea of translation is to bring over into another language, what's in the source text. But therefore, you have to respect the patterns and rules of the target language, which is very different from Greek. So what I'm getting at is the idea of an accurate translation is a kind of a misnomer. Of course, there are wrong translations. if you say, the word for a house is a bird, that's a wrong translation. But there are many ways of being right. So can I illustrate this with one illustration here, or do you want me to stop talking now?
Go ahead.
Okay, so let's take the first the middle bit here of the 2010. This guy is trying to preserve as much of the flavor of the Greek as possible. And the Greek begins with the word since, or epede, seeing that, right? Since, given that, something like that. But the reason Josephus does that is he's got his extremely long sentence. It reads like a legal contract in a way. If you've read a long legal contract, you can have these enormous long sentences. They go, whereas this, whereas that, and the other thing, and seeing this. And they get to the point, like, way at the end. That's what Josephus is doing here. So his point comes at the end of this thing. Basically, I wanted to write an accurate history of the war since it's so important and other people have tried, and since this, and I saw what happened, and I'm Josephus, and all this is a big disaster, and so on. Since all of that. So the problem is, however, that when you start with since, then you're committed to the rest of the, at least, half of this thing. The other guys decided, no, that's too much to ask of our readers. And so these little red markers are where they made their sentence breaks. And you see the 2010 guy, he took the whole thing of the first paragraph as one sentence, right? Whereas the other two decided, no, you can't do that. It's too long. But if you don't do that, if you drop the first, like the since, to say, I just want to describe how great the war was, whereas this guy says, since the war was so great, then you have to come up with some other techniques. So the guy on the left here, he said, he just wanted to say, okay, look, the war of the Jews against the Romans was a great war, and it has not lacked its historians. Of these, however, but that's not in the Greek text. The reason he had to add it was he's already changing the configuration of the Greek to bring it into English. The same on the right side, this guy said the historians of this war fall into two categories. That's not in the Greek, right? But the reason they're adding it in there is because they decided to break up Josephus's very long sentence, whereas the guy in the middle here didn't need to do that. Because he's just treating it as one long English sentence. Anyway, I'll stop there with that about comparing these translations, unless you wanted to go any farther. But my point is that they are all correct. That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. But they're completely different ways of dealing with the problem of bringing over the Greek into English. And we won't have time to get into all these details, but what I point out here with some of the underlining is they made significantly different choices, therefore also about words and about phrasing. So this guy on the right decided that he didn't want to include since blah, 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 I, Josephus, blah, 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 blah. It's just too long. So he took that out and he stuck in it a separate sentence. I am Josephus, son of Matthias, a Hebrew by race and a native of Jerusalem, and a priest. End of sentence. So that between the red bits there is a sentence. Whereas this guy in the middle didn't, because he incorporated it as a clause into the sentence. And this guy over here on the left, he decided to break it with long dashes, M dashes, right, to stick in. Oh, by the way, I'm Josephus, son of Matthias, a Hebrew by race, and so on. And notice, by the way, that the Hebrew by race is in this one and the other one, but it's not in the middle one. And here you have a case of a manuscript variant. Some manuscripts have a Hebrew by race, and the ones that this guy favored in the middle, they don't have that phrase. because it's suspected that it comes into Christian copying from the Apostle Paul, who said, in Philippians 3, I'm a Hebrew by race. And so there's some suspicion, because it's not in some manuscripts, that the reason it's not in some manuscripts is that it filtered in from Christian thinking about other things. So the end of the point I want to make, and this is my last page here to show you, is this is the translation I'm working on for the Brill Josephus project, which is a multi-volume international project to translate all of Josephus again and supply the first full historical commentary. About half of it's done already. Half of the 30 volumes are done, and the others will soon appear. But what you see here is we had to make all kinds of translation choices. You choose the manuscript reading you want. Then in English, you try to reflect the Greek as well as possible. Also, be consistent in your choice of English words for Greek words, which not every translator does. And then you have to try to think of the right literary register, the level, the right resonance. Is he being ironic? Is he being sarcastic? And then you think about, okay, he's writing in Rome for Latin speakers as well. Is he thinking of Latin words? What about the sentence structure? How clear can we make it in English? Where does the emphasis lie? Is it a good English sentence structure? So with this project, what we do is we try to be very literal. In fact, that very long sentence, opening sentence, is one long sentence in our translation. But the reason we can get away with that is the translation is just to anchor the commentary. And you see in the commentary, we put footnotes on everything. And then we say, okay, well, now let's try to explain this. So place names, narrative devices, persons mentioned, would the audience know about them? Are the numbers that he gives, like up here, he says 15,000 destroyed in combat, 2,200 prisoners. Are these plausible numbers? We discussed that. The place names mentioned over here. So all of these and manuscript variants, are all discussed in the commentary. So yeah. So the reason we can be very literal, the only reason we can, is that there's a commentary attached to it. Whereas the other translators I showed you didn't have any commentary, so they had to make their translations much more intelligible, as freestanding translations. We can live with a lot of ambiguity in our translation because it's anchoring the commentary, right? Do you see what I mean?
Yep.
Okay, I'll stop talking. Anyway, so when you ask about the upshot of all this is when you ask about variants, there are tens of thousands of manuscript variants. And we are not working from the original manuscripts because nobody can be spending their whole career traveling around Italy and France and Germany and Britain looking at precious manuscripts and sitting and comparing them all the time. We can't do that. So obviously, with the technology available today, most of those manuscripts are now digitized and available digitally. And what we really need is a new critical edition of Josephus. So this one was done in the 1880s and 90s. That's the one we still use because it's such an incredible amount of work to create such a thing, where you list all the variants, in the apparatus at the bottom. So that's what scholars do. And the upshot of it is we're never certain. Historians are never certain of really anything in the ancient past. It's a matter of judgment and argument always about which one you should prefer, which reading and why, and where does the weight of probability lie. But people aren't going to agree about that, right?
What do you think of the Slavonic Josephus? Because Robert Eisler claims, I know you talk about, you mentioned Robert Eisler in Josephus and the New Testament. because he thinks that the Slavonic Josephus is a late translation of the original Aramaic Josephus.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, Eisler was an incredibly brilliant guy, writing in the late 1920s and early 1930s, so almost a century ago. And he had some really creative ideas. And he had not even published his major work yet when the guy I was just talking about, there, Henry St. John Thackeray, published his Loeb Classical Library translation of Josephus. But he really liked Eisler, and they got along very well, and he was in awe of Eisler's learning. So he actually included a lot of Eisler's proposals, with question marks. You know, he didn't commit himself to them, but he mentioned them with. And so at the end of the Loeb Classical Library edition of Josephus' War, you have actually a section on the Slavonic editions. And the reason they are there and treated so seriously is because Thackeray thought, it might be possible. But that was a century ago. Since then, of course, a great deal has been done. Several real experts in Old North Russian, which is the Slavonic version, have studied the text in great detail. And the common opinion today, the latest experts have been Osinkina and Leemings, the father and daughter team, of Leemings is their last name. They've produced a Slavonic version, which you can get from Brill publishers, comparing the Slavonic and the Greek. And there are several scholars that came along the way, Mershevsky and others, Istrin. Anyway, the common view today is that it is a 13th century late translation, which stems from the Greek of Josephus, and that the additions that are not in Josephus can be better explained not as the original text, but as reactions to the Greek text and the needs of the church, the Orthodox Church in the 13th century.
So basically, they're saying that the Slavonic Josephus is, I'm not sure if it's the right way of putting it, but a forged imitation of the
not forged. Just I mean, there are several translations and versions of Josephus that developed later, and each of them takes its own path. So there are strict translations, like the Latin translation, right? But so, for example, already in the 4th century, you have a Christian reworking of Josephus' War called De Excidio of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem. And this author in Latin begins by saying, you know, Josephus is a good historian, very good historian, but the guy was an unbeliever. He wasn't a Christian. So we have to take the good out of his work, which is that which is conducive to believing the gospel, and supply it with Christian motives and Christian explanations. So it's a real shame this guy he remained a Jew and he didn't, convert. So we have to do the work of rescuing his history for Christianity. So there's a Latin translation, Pseudo-Hegesippus, we call the author of De Excidio. And this guy just flat out introduced all kinds of Christian stuff into Josephus. So that's already in the 4th century. Then in the 10th century, you have a Jewish reworking of Josephus called Sefer Yosipon in Hebrew. And the Sefer Yosipon deals more with this 4th century Latin Christianization of Josephus than it does with the original Josephus. And it takes the Latin Josephus and says, no, there's no way this guy was so Christian. We have to reclaim the Jewish Josephus. And so you have now a Hebrew Josephus that is changing the stories to make him more of a kind of nationalist Hebrew hero. So, for example, the Masada story, instead of everybody killing themselves at the end, which is not a very Jewish thing to do, they fight till the end, and are, they become kind of heroes that way. So each version of the story changes. Josephus is reworked. I wouldn't call them forgeries in any case. They are creative reworkings. And so the Slavonic Josephus in the 13th century into Old North Russian is the same thing. It's a reworking with lots of new interests added into the text. Yeah.
Speaking on the what you were just saying about the Masada incident,
Yeah.
is Josephus's account of the Jewish revolt very accurate, or are there some or several major issues with his testimony in terms of comparing the archaeology to what Josephus says?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question, Jacob, because it's it's the one sort of on everybody's mind. Whenever I give a public lecture on Josephus, that's the question I can be sure somebody's going to ask in the audience. How reliable is Josephus? The problem in answering it is this for a historian. So you have to bear with me here for a second, but the whole idea of doing history came about as a rejection of reliable sources. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is the naive way of looking at the past is to say, we have reliable sources, we just read them and trust them, right? That's a traditional way of understanding the past. It's like you train kids. Every child goes to school. You tell them what the past was, and they learn it. They absorb it. What created history was the idea that this is no good, right? We cannot rely on trustworthy sources. History is literally, when we say that Herodotus is the father of history, well, the word history literally means originally investigation, inquiry, research, historia. That's what the Greek word means. It doesn't actually have anything to do with the past. So it was initially used by philosophers investigating nature. They were doing history. They weren't investigating the past. They were just investigating what is true. And this idea of history, therefore, what the historian's job is not to find reliable sources. It's much more like to be a detective. So the detective is not looking for the one true account, right? When they interview witnesses, they don't go around saying, okay, this person's reliable. They cross-examine, they compare, they try to come up with their own theory of the case of what happened, right? Which they can present to a prosecutor. But this picture that they create is not the picture of any of their witnesses. Even if they're eyewitnesses, they don't just say, yeah, that person's right, that person's free of bias, that person is trustworthy. They say, okay, that person saw what they saw and said what they said, and they're doing their best, we hope. But they didn't see that much, and we have to compare it with other evidence. We have to compare it with forensic, material evidence, whatever, physical evidence. So that's what historians do. So it's not a matter of, for us in our daily work, of saying, okay, is Josephus reliable or not, and over against archaeology, which in this case is the physical evidence. It's that these two kinds of evidence provide different angles, right? So here we have some starting points to answer your question. There are some things we know didn't happen in Josephus, and that for openers, his big speeches. He gives big speeches like at Masada. He gives Eleazar at Masada this two-part speech, which is brilliant, right? And it's what convinces everybody in the end to go offer their necks and say, let's die. We know that this was not Sid. We can be sure of that. Why? Because we know that ancient historians wrote speeches out of their own creativity. It was expected of them to do that. That's part of the game. You write speeches for your characters that suit what they would say. But there's no, how on earth would Josephus know what Eleazar said on Masada? He would have no, he was in Rome at the time. He would have absolutely no idea. But his speech, that the two-part speech he wrote for him, fits with Josephus's themes and language and diction. But that's not considered inaccurate in ancient history. So let me come back one step. Let me ask you a question, Jacob. The category of accuracy, what do we normally declare accurate or inaccurate? Like, what does the word really mean? What can we, well, most often, what are we concerned about that something be accurate or not accurate? What kinds of things would you say?
And the way I would answer it is, one can't be absolutely certain how accurate the answer, one's answer can be to the question, but it depends on what the weight of the evidence is.
Okay, but you're thinking in historical terms already. So if I can ask you to forget about history for a second.
Okay.
In ordinary life, what are things that we can say, this is accurate, no, that's not accurate? What kinds of things do we trust to be accurate? Or do we need to be accurate in our daily lives, for example?
Well, when you go into a vehicle and the car tells you how much gas is in there, you open the refrigerator, you see it's on, so you can say that the refrigerator is cooling the products that you have in there, or your
and our watches, anything. So the term accurate, what I'm going to suggest to you actually is that the concept of accuracy applied to history is a category mistake. It's a mistake of categories, because the things that we can declare accurate are things that are measurable. Those are the only things that can be called accurate or not accurate, right? Accuracy is a term of measurement. So it's a quantitative term. So the temperature in the refrigerator, the time on the watch, we know that they are accurate or not accurate because we can measure them against some kind of standard, right? There is a standard that gives the term accuracy its meaning. That's what accuracy means. It's correct according to a measurable standard of some kind, right? And what I would like to suggest to your viewers is that when it comes to history writing, accuracy is not a useful term. Inaccuracy, in the sense of if somebody just made up a story, like, said Julius Caesar went to India in 55 BC. Well, it's not so much that it's inaccurate, it's just made up, right? It's not inaccurate because it's not measured against like an atomic timekeeper or something like that. It's not inaccurate. It's not like if I'm making pancakes and I put in 200 mils of pancake mix and 200 mils of buttermilk or whatever. I need to get that accurate, but that's a measurement, right? So it's not inaccurate that Caesar, the claim that Caesar did these things. It's just completely wrong. It's invented. It didn't happen. The reason I stress this is that what ancient writers are writing about mainly is not about measurable things. They're not writing about, Masada the summit of Masada stood so many meters above the floor of the valley. Josephus actually he has a claim about that, and it's mistaken. It's inaccurate. So there we can say it's inaccurate, but so what? He was going from his memory, and he's not that far off. He's mistaken, but he has an impression of Masada from what he remembers. He describes the ramp, he describes the walls, he describes the number of towers. He's actually pretty close, probably a lot closer than I would be if I tried to recall from memory someplace I've been. So what? Who cares about accuracy? The things that can be measured in Josephus, like when he says, Tarichea was 30 stadia away from Tiberias. Well, we can measure that because we know roughly what a stadium is, so we can measure it. Who cares? That's not what he's writing about. He's not giving us a fact book. He's talking about who started the war and why, and what the reactions were, and how people felt, and what motivated people. These things are not susceptible of measurement, right? They are not susceptible of being called accurate or inaccurate. They are analyses, they are opinions, they are assessments. I mean, when we talk about each other, even those, like when we talk about our children, our spouses, our partners, if we say, that person is motivated by this, that's not accurate or inaccurate, because people are complex, right? We're just making a claim about one aspect of their character, but it can't be measured. So that's a long way of saying that I think there's a chasm here between what historians do and kind of popular impressions. And because most of us in school were taught history as something we needed to memorize and trust, then the question becomes with Josephus, can I just trust him? Is he reliable? Can I rely on him? Is he accurate? But I'm trying to suggest this is a misnomer. It's a category mistake, because what we do as historians is, of course, we don't expect them to be accurate. Would mean like to have a God's eye view of what happened, and to somehow in all its plenitude and richness say everything about it that's worth knowing. Of course, that's not possible. So that's not what historians do. They just look at what he said. They say, okay, he's an ancient writer. He has his themes, his issues, his what he's trying to put across. And then we have to investigate the problems that interest us, like Masada, what happened at Masada. And we take his story and we try to see, okay, how did he come up with that story? What's he trying to do? We look at the archaeological evidence, and then we posit a scenario about what really happened here at Masada that would explain what's in Josephus and explain what's in the archaeology. But the archaeology can almost never, it can, but it's not very often that the archaeology can really confront or disprove a literary analysis, because they're talking about two different things, right? Archaeology is not usually going to be able to show motive or idea or anything like that, which is precisely what people like Josephus or Tacitus are writing about. Do you see what I mean?
Yep.
Okay. That was a long answer.
But I think I'm glad it was long, because it really explains to the audience what you're trying to tell them and why, and with a very thorough and detailed answer. Because it's a lot of analysis involved.
Yeah.
I want to go back to what you were saying earlier about there was a particular phrase that was used by Christian copyists of Josephus with something that Paul wrote.
Yeah.
And what I want to ask you is, when we think of that, when a Christian copyist is using something Paul said to translate Josephus or copy Josephus, is that an example? Could it be an example of the problems surrounding, say, something else that Josephus wrote, say, the Testimonium Flavianum? Could there be other parts of Josephus that are questionable? Like, could we question if he wrote this or that, just like the Testimonium?
Yeah, absolutely. So your viewers know what the Testimonium is, I suppose. It's the passage in Antiquities 18 where Josephus is describing Pontius Pilate's tenure as a low-level governor, equestrian governor of Judea. which may have lasted as long as 18 years. His term there is even if it only lasted 10 or 11 years, it was unusually long tenure. And in that description of Pilate, he says, he's talking about disturbances that arose, and he's also talking about events in Rome at the same time. And then he says, about this time, there was a guy, a man, if one should call him really a man, who, did these amazing things. And then he talks about his arrest, his crucifixion, and then the belief of his followers that he was raised from the dead. And in the middle of that, well, not in the middle, near the beginning, he says he taught these things, he did these things, and he was the Christ. He was, in Greek, o Christos. So yeah, the discussion for centuries has been about whether Josephus could have written that. And the views that have been expressed among scholars range from this whole paragraph is an insertion by Christian copyists, indeed, or most of it, almost all of it, maybe even some scholars have said all of it, like the famous William Whiston, the most widely circulated translation of Josephus by William Whiston. He thought the whole thing was authentic. It fit in his view, but the vast majority of scholars today hold that most of it or much of it is actually from Josephus, but some phrases in it comparable to that Hebrew of the Hebrews in the prologue to the war. The phrases like that may have come in by Christian copyists, and the most obvious case is he was the Christ. And there are various reasons for that. But another alternative, however, I should mention quickly is, and this is, I think, a very compelling hypothesis by Alice Whaley, who's a real expert on this stuff and the history of its transmission. She wrote a very, very fine book on the whole history of the issue. She argues that it's most likely, actually, that Josephus said more than that, not less. So it's not as likely that that phrase was inserted as that what he wrote was he was believed to be, supposed to be, thought to be the Christ, or called the Christ, something like that. And that's what dropped out. So the scribes actually dropped out the qualification and just said he was the Christ. Forget about he was believed to be. He was. So those are the main options that are on the table. And the way that people argue them, of course, is the main question. For a historian, it's not about your conclusions, because history is not a church. History is not about what you believe. It's about what you can show, how you explain the evidence. And so the kinds of argumentation that are used are the main thing. And such issues are, for example, how much of this language is typical of Josephus, and how much is odd in terms of how he uses language. And a number of his phrases turn out to be, in that passage, turn out to be very typical of him, but not in an obvious way. So 2 or 3 of them are only typical of that section of the Antiquities, which is an unusual section in style. So that's quite interesting, because if you said, it was a forger, a Christian, copyist who just stuck the whole passage in, well, he didn't do it in a very simple way. He would have had to do almost miraculous levels of research in ancient terms, because they didn't have the tools we have, the digital tools to search phrasing and things like that. So he would have had to have done that kind of work. So that's one kind of argument. Another kind of argument is, could his audience have understood what a phrase like "he was the Christ" means? And no, that's not how he writes. Usually he writes that somebody was known as or was called, by a nickname, something like that. He doesn't just say he was this. But then on the other hand, if a Christian created the whole thing, why would he say he was the Christ and not he is the Christ? So it's also not quite perfectly Christian language. Another consideration is that in Antiquities 20, there's a passage that refers to Jesus' brother, James, as you all know, Jacob, and some of your viewers probably know. And that passage is not very much, there are scholars who dispute its authenticity, but not nearly so many at all, because it looks like it fits quite well in Josephus's whole way of narrating. And James, the brother of Jesus, is quite incidental also. His name is incidental to that passage. Moreover, he's introduced in a very casual way as just one of a bunch of people whom a certain high priest decided to execute while the governor was away. And it fits Josephus's whole kind of way of writing to say that. So if that passage is authentic, and it begins by saying one of the guys that he executed was the brother of the one known as Christ. By the way, this guy's name is James. He was one of them. And that all fits very well, but it suggests that he'd already referred to a Jesus known as Christ. So these are in a nutshell, the kind of issues that come up in discussing the passage. Oh, a final issue, of course, is I should mention, to be fair, that the 4th century Christian author Eusebius is the first one to quote this passage in full, in slightly different versions. Earlier Christian authors like Origen had read Josephus and were convinced that he was not a believer in any way, a Christian. But here we have this passage showing up in Eusebius, and a couple of the phrases, one in particular, is very typical of Eusebius's writing. So that's another consideration to throw into the mix, that as these texts were all being copied together, and Josephus is quoted a lot in Eusebius, and Eusebius is being copied by the same people who are copying Josephus, it's entirely possible that there's some cross-fertilization there, and at least a couple of the phrases that Eusebius wrote in quoting Josephus were read into the Josephus text. On the other hand, Josephus differs from Eusebius in a couple of places, and that's also quite interesting, because then you would think that the Eusebius version should have been in Josephus. So I'll stop with that. But these are the kinds of criteria that come up in the discussion.
So basically, you're saying another way of looking at the Testimonium is it's not a question of which pieces of it was there, if the whole thing was or wasn't there, but basically early Christians had different takes on it with the way they wrote it, the phrasing it. Again, another translation variant in that sense.
Yeah, I'm saying that, and I'm also saying that, historians can or ought to be able to live with uncertainty, because that's
right.
It's like being a scientist. I mean, we don't know, we just investigate. And one of the differences, again, in the popular discussions is that people want to know. So there are all kinds of people who claim certainty. No, this is how it was. No, it's an interpolation. No, you can't. You're crazy. You can't believe that. No Christian, no Jew would write that. No Christian. This is all completely beside the point from a historian's point of view. We're not required to believe things. The conclusions don't matter. The question is how you get there, right? And certainty is out of the question, I think, because there's so many unknown variables. The number of variables that we know are already quite huge. And then, like Donald Rumsfeld used to say, before your time, Jacob, I think, former Secretary of Defense, where there are known knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and the number of unknown unknowns is quite huge. So we guess. So there's just no point in trying to claim certainty that this is what actually Josephus wrote, I think.
What do you make of William Winston's claim that Josephus was a Christian? Obviously, one of the reasons he thought he was a Christian was because he believed that the whole Testimonium was authentic, and there was some other reasons he thought that as well. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. Whiston is an absolutely fascinating guy. His life story at the end of the 1600s and early 1700s is amazing. I am not expert in that period. I'm an ancient historian. But for example, your viewers might be interested in a wonderful article by Mordecai Feingold, I think, who really probed into his life story at the time. It's really worth reading. But basically, he lived a very fraught life. He was a brilliant guy who got the job as Isaac Newton's successor at Cambridge as the Lucasian professor of mathematics. I mean, the guy was stone brilliant. But then he got himself kicked out because, like Newton, he wasn't just a scientist. I mean, everything was all mixed in together. And they both were fascinated by, spiritual questions, religious questions, historical questions. Each of them was quite absorbed with chronology of the world, biblical chronology, and so on. And Whiston was considered at the time a heretic. He had a view he was a Christian, deeply committed Christian, but he didn't believe in the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He didn't believe that there were three persons in one and all of that. So that got him kicked out. In those days, you had to be an Orthodox Christian, a believing Christian, to hold a position in Oxford, Cambridge. So he got himself booted out in 1710. And after a while, he turned quickly, actually, to writing and speaking on Christian and historical issues of world chronology and all of that. So to come back to the question of Josephus as a Christian, he didn't seem to believe that in his early career, but he came to believe it by, I think, the 1720s, before he even turned to the translation of Josephus. He began to, so there are various reasons why. I mentioned before that this guy, Pseudo-Hegesippus, said, okay, Josephus is a good historian, but the problem is he wasn't a believer. He wasn't a Christian. And this was always a problem for Christians using Josephus, right? The more you rely on him and the more you say he proves the truth of Christianity, the more of a problem you have in that he was not a Christian. Because if he's so smart and if he saw so clearly the truth of things, then why did he not see the truth of Christianity? So this became a problem. Now for Whiston, it became a problem because he began to rely more and more and more on Josephus. He was, like most people of his time, anti-Jewish. That is, he thought that the Jews should have accepted Christ. They should have, followed the gospel, and they were just, stubbornly clinging on to their faith. And he came to believe, in terms of the chronology of the world, that the Jews had fiddled with Scripture. They had deliberately changed Scripture. And his eventual way of proving that was to look at Josephus and to say Josephus, where he departs from the biblical text in his chronological calculations, in the numbers he gives for, the time that Abraham lived after the flood and things like that. When Josephus does that, he's relying on the original authentic Jewish scripture. But the Jews, after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 130s, they fiddled with the scripture to make Bar Kokhba appear like a messianic figure, and that means they had to redo the chronology a bit. So Josephus is the guy. He got it. He's the authentic, truthful guy. Moreover, he thought that a Christian text that circulated with Josephus's writings, I think in his translation it's called the Discourse on Hades, or the Exhortation to the Greeks, that was by Josephus. Now it's quite a Christian text. It's talking about hell and eternal punishment and resurrection, but in a Christian way. It was actually not by Josephus. Most scholars today think it was by Hippolytus, the bishop of Rome in the late 2nd century. But Whiston was sure that it was by Josephus because of some verbal parallels. And therefore, all of these things came together for him to say, you know what? And if you think of his very supportive way of describing John the Baptist, Jesus in the Jesus passage, the Testimonium Flavianum, and James, all of them described with a certain amount of sympathy. Simplest explanation is he was a Christian, but not an Orthodox Christian. He did not believe in the Trinity. He did not even believe in the divinity of Christ. So he was what were known in antiquity as Ebionite Christians. He was a Jewish Christian who saw Jesus as the Messiah of the Jews, but he still followed, obviously Josephus still followed the Torah, the laws of Moses, because he everywhere celebrates them and says how wonderful they are and how complete and satisfying they are. So he clearly was an observant Jew, but he also accepted that Jesus was the Messiah. And to add the final kind of twist, Whiston thought it likely, he kind of kept expanding his Christian view of Josephus. He eventually ended up proposing that he went back to Jerusalem from Rome and became the bishop of Jerusalem, because Eusebius, in his list of the bishops of Jerusalem, he has a guy named Joseph. I think he's like the 14th bishop or something like that of Jerusalem around the turn of the 2nd century. And so Whiston proposed eventually, hey, that same name. So, Joseph's an extremely common name in among ancient Jews. But he said, there you go. He became the bishop of Jerusalem. So he was a Christian, but of this kind of Ebionite persuasion. Does that answer your question more or less?
Yeah, yes, it does. What do you think about the different versions of the Testimonium in other texts, like Agapius, Michael Viserion, and these other guys? And the question I have regarding that is also there's two different testimoniums in Jerome. What would you think could be the most probable scenario regarding the testimonium? What do you think Josephus most likely said about Jesus?
Yeah, fine question. I have to emphasize at the beginning that I don't know.
Right.
But since your question is framed very carefully and appropriately as what do I think is the most probable explanation? Well, first of all, to lay my cards on the table, I've written quite a bit about historical method, and I happen to think that historians should be economical, not economical with the truth, but economical in their explanations. That is to say, just like scientists, the simplest explanation is going to be the most likely one until there's some reason not to, that there's a problem with the simple explanation. So just as, in science or in medicine, you have a headache, it could be that you have a brain tumor. You go to the doctor and you say, got a headache. Well, the doctor's going to try the simplest explanation. Headaches are extremely common. They can have multiple causes. Take 2 aspirins and call me in the morning. Only if your headache doesn't yield to the simple explanation do you then proceed to the more complex explanation. So I think it's much the same way with history. We should start with the simplest explanations. Anything's possible, right? You can have every level of complexity to explain what's in the text, but the simplest one is the one we should go with, unless there's some reason not to accept it. So, what's the simplest? What are the simplest adjustments you would have to make to the Testimonium in order for it to make sense as a piece of Josephus's work? In my own work, I've studied each phrase in Antiquities 1863 to 64, and most of them either look distinctively Josephan, apart from and but and so on, but even phrases like around this time, for example, that's a classic Josephus phrase in that section of his work. That's how he links up episodes. And then it goes on from there. Even things like calling a man divine, he does that elsewhere in the Antiquities, although it sounds odd, right? It sounds not very Jewish. So most of the phrases there look either on a scale from they are distinctively Josephus, which is Josephan, or in that passage of Antiquities, or they are tolerably intelligible as part of Josephus. The 2 or 3 that really stand out, one is he was the Christ. One is if you should call him a man, right? And the other one is talking about his resurrection, that the divine prophets foretold these things of him. Now, in each of those cases, you need to ask, what's the best explanation of this? To take a really minimalist view, it's possible that the prophets foretelling the resurrection is meant to go with what his followers believed. So Josephus is not giving his own opinion there. He's saying his followers believed him alive because the prophets foretold this. That is, that's why they believed it, because they thought the prophets held this. So on a minimalist reading, I think the thing that demands attention is he was the Christ. That's the crucial thing. The 2 or 3 other phrases, not so sure. Now, Agapius and Jerome and Michael are very interesting, and Alice Whaley gives them full play and full discussion. If anyone wants a compact view, so she's written this full big book, but if you want a shorter essay of hers, in the 2016 volume Companion to Josephus, edited by Zuleika Rogers and Honora Chapman from Blackwell, Alice Whaley has a chapter in there on the Testimonium, and it's a beautifully succinct chapter in which she takes up all of these questions. But I think she makes a compelling case that if you try to understand, let's hypothesize this, scenarios, as a detective would. Okay, so you say, let's take a scenario. Let's say that the later authors, Jerome, Agapius, Michael, Agapius in the 10th century, Michael in the 12th century, Jerome in the 4th century, they didn't know anything about the text. And then they wrote, so Jerome wrote in his version, Jesus was believed to be, credebatur in Latin. He was believed to be the Christ, the Messiah. And there's a very similar phrase in Michael in Arabic, I guess. Actually, don't know off the cuff. I can't remember. Is it Syriac or Arabic? I think Arabic. He was thought to be, right? So these are Christian writers, all adding in the phrase "he was thought to be." So where does that come from? Well, it's very difficult to believe that if they knew the version in Eusebius, he was the Christ, that they would have introduced, no. We just think he was thought to be. It's easier to explain things the other way around, so argues Whaley. It's easier to believe that they knew the text of Josephus to read, he was thought to be, and that Eusebius is the odd one out, that in the manuscripts of Josephus and in Eusebius, that has dropped out, the qualification that makes it a doubtful attribution, right? Do you see what I mean? So
Yep.
the way I think the simplest way to explain this is not to say that Christian writers developed doubts and began to put qualifications into the text, but rather the text that they knew of Josephus already had the qualifications in it. And those qualifications dropped out in Eusebius' version. So if you ask me what I think is most likely, I would say that makes more sense to me, that kind of scenario. But as to what Josephus actually wrote, I don't think we can have any great confidence at all.
One more thing I want to get into briefly before we close out for today is that in Josephus in the New Testament, you also talk about the possibility that Luke Acts has a familiarity with Josephus's work. You
Yes.
also postulated the possibility that it may be the other way around, or one could think it's the other way around.
Yeah, I dismissed that.
Right,
As a
I remember
likelihood.
that.
Yeah. That was argued in at the end of the 19th century by a particular scholar, but nobody has ever thought that plausible afterwards. Anyway, sorry, what's your question exactly, Jacob?
What were the reasons, if you could go through some of the reasons, and maybe in a future episode we can expand more on this. Luke Acts, what were some of the reasons that led you to think it's probable that Luke Acts used Josephus?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's again a question of what's the simplest explanation of evidence. And what you have, so traditionally, the way scholars have looked at this, everybody's always realized that there are some things in Luke Acts that also turn up in Josephus, and those are the only two places. So, for example, the census under Quirinius that led to an enrollment to taxation, where it's described in a major kind of narrative way. Josephus and Luke Acts, and Josephus' Antiquities and Luke Acts are the main places. To this guy, Lysanias, tetrarching in Abilene, in the beginning of Luke chapter 3, he's describing who all the different rulers were around the time. And he says, Tiberius was emperor, and Antipas was up in Galilee, and this guy was over here. And in Abilene, Lysanias was tetrarching. But he never mentions him again. He just says that right there. And the interesting thing is he leaves out most of the local petty rulers of the region, but he mentions this guy. Well, he happens to be a major figure in Josephus, right? But he's not mentioned again in Luke Acts. Then the Egyptian, the prophet called the Egyptian, when Paul is arrested and taken to the tribune in Acts 21. So yeah, he's brought before the tribune, and the tribune says, so you're not the Egyptian who led the Sicarii. So that's another term that's only in Josephus, quite frequently in Josephus. Only time in Acts, in Luke Acts, is there. So you're not the Egyptian, a guy mentioned in Josephus, who led the Sicarii into the desert. You're not him. And Paul says, no, I'm not. Why would you think that? So the question is, why is this author mentioning these people? Then his treatment of Pharisees and Sadducees, he calls the Pharisees the most precise hieresis in Greek, the most precise school among us. So here's the point, Jacob, that this language is all from Josephus. Now, what scholars have usually done with this, they've just kind of, I think in the US, in American football, you have a Hail Mary pass. So it's like a desperate move in football, just get the ball down the field, throw it, and hope that somebody catches it. This is how I would characterize scholarship on this issue. So what people say is, all right, there are these parallels: Egyptian, Sicarii, Quirinius, Census, Pharisees, Sadducees. There's a bunch of quite striking parallels that are only really between Josephus and Luke Acts. But since, and Judas the Galilean, and a guy named Theudas as well, in the speech of Gamaliel in Acts chapter 5, he says, leave the Christians alone. If they are from God, we shouldn't touch them. If they're not from God, they will be scattered, destroyed, just like the previous guys we've had, Theudas and Judas. So first came Theudas, and he was a big rabble rouser, but he was dispersed. Then came Judas at the time of the census under Quirinius, and he was dispersed. So leave him alone. So you got all of these overlaps between the two authors. What scholars used to say is the Hail Mary pass they said, well, must have been common sources, because Josephus and Luke Acts don't agree. They don't agree in how they use these. Like, for example, Gamaliel puts Theudas before Judas, whereas in Josephus, Judas the Galilean comes in 6 CE at the time of the census, and Theudas is later in the 40s CE. So they said, if he were following Josephus, the argument goes, he would have copied Josephus's information accurately. And here you can talk about accuracy because you're talking about, measuring, comparing one thing against another. He would have accurately copied out, the order of events. But since he didn't, since he uses these characters in different ways in his work, there's no way he could have been dependent on Lukács, could have been dependent on Josephus. They must have drawn from comparable sources, right? So that's been the traditional explanation of the overlaps between them. The observation of overlaps is not new. What's new with my argument is, wait a second, that's a Hail Mary pass. You're just saying, it must have been some common sources. Yeah, okay. But what did that source look like? Think about it for a minute. What source would have used this precise language? What source would have represented a group or groups in Judea as Sicarii? What other author would have called a certain pseudo-prophet the Egyptian without naming him? Well, in all these cases, you see actually that Josephus has the unique narrative need to configure things this way. This is his language. This is not some kind of universal neutral language. This is Josephus' language. He calls the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes hiereses, philosophical schools. Is one term for a school. That's his language because it's his construction. Nobody else does that. He's the one that calls the Pharisees the most precise of the schools, right, in this particular language, because it fits with his diction and his vocabulary. So my argument is these are, as far as we know, distinctive narrative traits of Josephus. And if the distinctive traits of one author turn up in another author, then you have the simplest explanation of that is some kind of literary dependence. It's as simple as that. So with Lysanias in Abilene, Josephus makes a big deal of him. In the latter part of his Antiquities, he's a recurring figure, right? So that would explain why, if you had an author in Luke Acts who is trying to pull in impressive sounding historical information, he would remember this name, even though he has absolutely no function in Luke Acts. Why does he mention him? It's always been a puzzle. Why does he mention this guy of all the local petty rulers and nobody else when he has no function in the narrative? Simplest explanation is he heard him repeatedly from Josephus. And the census under Quirinius is a big watershed event in Josephus. Like, it's a major thing, and Judas the Galilean is a major figure connected with it in Josephus, nobody else that we know of. So again, the question is simply, are these distinctive narrative traits of Josephus or not? If they are, and they turn up in Luke Acts, then Luke Acts is in some sense derivative of Josephus for these things.
Well, thank you for joining me today. I really enjoyed this conversation. I really enjoyed your answers to the questions. Yeah, overall, I really enjoyed this conversation. I really did. I think.
Well, it's go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say it's my pleasure. I always love to talk about these things, and for me, the biggest delight is that people are interested. I know there are tons of people who are interested in these questions because they're really quite important. But there's such a big divide between what historians do in our daily lives and our work, and what gets discussed in the internet kind of, discussion rooms. There's such a big gap between those things that for me, it's a real pleasure to try to break down that chasm a little bit.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream.